The country of Cuba is the largest of the Caribbean islands and is located just 90 miles off the southern coast of Florida. It is roughly 750 miles long and ranges in width from 25 to 120 miles. Its breathtaking scenery consists mostly of flatlands and rolling plains, but also contains a few mountain ranges, such as the Sierra Maestra in the east. Its semi-tropical climate keeps the island at a comfortable 70 to 80 degrees throughout most of the year. Cuba is also rich in exotic wildlife, both in and out of the water, and has a beautiful assortment of plant life. Before Christopher Columbus discovered the island in 1492, it was inhabited by a number of indigenous tribes. At first, relations were friendly, but eventually more Spaniards came, and the natives who could not be forced into slavery were killed. The Spanish also brought slaves from Africa as well to work on plantations and grow two of Cuba's biggest imports, sugar and tobacco. Eventually, the island became a regular stop for ships crossing the Atlantic to South America and Mexico. In the mid-19th century, Cuba's inhabitants became tired of their Spanish rule and sought independence. Several small revolutions occurred, and Cuba gained its independence from Spain with the help from the U.S. in 1898. However, the celebration was short, as many Cubans felt they were trading one master for another when the U.S. took over. In 1934, the government the United States had set up was overthrown by Fulgencio Batista. Batista was seen by many as a ruthless dictator who controlled most of the money in the country, leaving its people to suffer in poverty. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista's rule after several previous failed attempts. The United States, angered by Castro's socialist ideas in an attempt to control U.S. businesses in Cuba, imposed a trade embargo against Cuba in 1960, which severely injured Cuba's economy. During this time, Cuba held strong ties to the Soviet Union, which financially supported the island country, until it fell in the early 1990s, leaving much of Cuba in desperate poverty and what Castro would later refer to as a special period. Since the embargo was put into place, relations between the United States and Cuba have been harsh and have included incidents such as the Bay of Pigs incident and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under the leadership of Fidel Castro, much of Cuba's economy was tightly controlled by the government. Through much of the 1990s, remittances from relatives abroad were a crucial factor in keeping the Cuban economy afloat. But since then, the U.S. government has reduced the amount of money that authorized travelers can carry into Cuba. It has also allowed remittances to be sent only to immediate family members. The American dollar is often seen as a better form of currency in comparison to the Cuban peso, and some stores even choose to only accept American money. In 2008, Castro's brother, Raul, took over when Castro retired. The Cuban government has since lifted several of the restrictions held over the economy and opened opportunities for small businesses to flourish in an attempt to improve the overall economy. Unfortunately, the only real opportunities for financial stability appear to lie in jobs that deal with tourism, which has left many families still struggling to survive. In addition, the government is seen as controlling and unjust. Many Cubans refuse to speak out against their government for fear of imprisonment or worse. For these reasons, some Cubans would prefer to leave the country and come to the United States in hopes of better opportunities. In 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson approved the Cuban Adjustment Act, which allowed for Cubans to obtain a visa to the United States, either as political refugees or through a lottery in which they could apply. This is how Jorge Hernandez and his mother were able to come to the U.S. when he was just 15 years old. When asked how he was given the opportunity to come to the States, Jorge describes a lottery in which Cubans could submit paperwork stating why they would like to come to the U.S., and they are often able to come as part of a residency. He and his mother first arrived in Miami and were given the opportunity to either stay in Miami, go to Michigan, or move to Kentucky. They chose Kentucky, and some outside organization, he couldn't remember the name, helped them to get settled here. His mom, discouraged by the Cuban economy and controlling government, decided the best way to find a better future would be to move. He describes a very bleak and hopeless country when describing his homeland, saying that the people are starving and no one will help. Before leaving, his mother worked as a clerk in a store. He recalls that she made the equivalent of $5 a week, but to buy just one loaf of bread cost $7. He says that if you worked a job that dealt with tourists, you can make money. Otherwise, no. Jorge also described a cruel and controlling government. You don't want the police near you, he said. They're corrupt and beat people. The government controls everything. Just 2 years ago, they finally allowed Cubans to have internet and stay in hotels. He says that before that, the hotels were only for tourists, and that the Cubans were not allowed to interact with the tourists. He believes this is because the Cuban government wants to give a false image of Cuba to those in the outside world, and notes that in Cuba it's taboo to talk poorly about the government. He calls it a hidden oppression. Despite his views of Cuba's government, Jorge is proud of his Cuban heritage and has a deep love for his people and culture. Upon walking into his home, one can expect to see brightly colored walls, orange and red, several photos of family members, a metal cross that depicts Christ's crucifixion, and some small trinkets. Some of the trinkets are typical of what you might see in any American household. Others display the Cuban culture, such as a small Cuban flag that sits by the TV. There are two paintings, which are brightly colored and appear to be somewhat tribal. According to Jorge, these pay tribute to his African ancestry. You might also expect to hear salsa music in the background. Jorge says dance is a major part of his culture, and he enjoys all Latin music from salsa to jazz. The aroma of Cuban food is almost always lingering in his house. A traditional and very popular Cuban dish is moros y cristianos, a bean and rice dish. Rice is eaten with nearly every meal, which makes sense as it is fairly inexpensive and filling. Outside of his love for food and music, Jorge said he also enjoys watching and playing baseball, Cuba's most popular sport. Baseball, of course, was brought to Cuba from the United States in the early 20th century and has been a favorite ever since. Overall, the Cuban way of life is one that is built around family, friends, and making the most of life. Cubans are, by nature, very welcoming and kind people. Jorge and his wife Carla open their home to both new and old guests. He comments that visitors are treated like royalty even in the most modest of homes, and that open and friendly environment is something he misses about his home country. He says people in the U.S. are not as open or friendly, and even notes that the Cuban way of greeting, where you give a kiss on the cheek, is much more personal than that of the American handshake. This was just a part of the culture shock he says he experienced upon coming to the States. He also struggled with learning the language, and although he mastered conversational English after being here for just 6 months, he still feels that he will never feel comfortable with the language. He speaks to his young children in Spanish only, as he knows they will receive English instruction when they are in school. And most importantly, he strives to teach them to be responsible. One thing he says bothers him about the U.S. is how wasteful and greedy people can be. Compared to the poverty in Cuba, it can be often enraging to see how little appreciation there is in the States for things like food, shelter, and the necessities. When asked to comment on education in Cuba, Jorge simply stated that it was very good and that education is free to everyone. Upon further research, one will find that very good is somewhat of an understatement, as the country has had an educational system that, despite the falling economy, is flourishing. Many would argue that it is better than that of many first and second world countries. Under the rule of Batista, education was not seen as important, and was possibly even considered a threat to the government. During this time, much of the country was considered to be illiterate. When Castro took over, he focused much of his attention on education and medicine. As a result, Cuba has practically eliminated illiteracy, as well as assisted in making some major medical advances throughout the years. With the poor economy, Castro noticed that many teachers were leaving the field of education to work in tourism. To counter this, he raised the amount of money the government put into education and reformed their educational system, which differs greatly from that of the U.S. in that students attend regular school until 9th or 10th grade and then begin to study in their chosen career field. There are several important points to keep in mind when determining how to best serve any students from Cuba that may enter your classroom. First, a greeting from a parent with a kiss to the cheek may be an invasion of your personal bubble, but it's completely normal in Cuba. There's a strong emphasis on education in Cuban society, and everyone is expected to learn. Therefore, the parents of your student will also hold the same educational values. In Cuba, much of the education can be considered biased due to government control. Don't be surprised if initial parent and student views of education seem to be very politically based. In addition, understand that most immigrants from Cuba are seeking a better life than that what is available to them in their home country. Many of these people gave up everything and left everyone they knew for the promise of a better life. The transition will be difficult. Language barriers will probably be present, and culture shock at the availability of resources is going to overwhelm them at first. They may even be confused if their child qualifies for free lunch, or surprised at the number of Americans who will openly bash the government. Finally, keep in mind the negative stereotypes that our country may have for their people and how that may be affecting their time here. All too often, people see immigrants, especially those from Latin America, as people who cheat the system and take our jobs. Social ignorance is unfortunate, but it's our job to recognize it and change it in whatever way possible.